Within the labyrinthine corridors of the Escorial Charles II of Spain moved like a shadow, his form gaunt and uncertain, the weight of centuries pressing invisibly upon his fragile shoulders. To those who glimpsed him pale, trembling mouth ajar, in a perpetual uncertain expression, he seemed less a sovereign and more an omen. Whispered prayers drifted through the palace, mingling with the rumors that grew each year more desperate that their king was bewitched, cursed by forces older than the crown itself. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One, as if some malign spirit had taken root where the bloodline had once run strong. Yet Charles bore not the marks of the supernatural, but the unmistakable imprint of his ancestors' pride, a lineage so entangled by ambition that its branches withered, giving birth to a child shunned by his own house. Every day unfolded in dim, echoing chambers suffused with the scent of burning wax and ancient medicine. Charles's face, sculpted by generations of royal unions, carried the unmistakable Habsburg jaw, so pronounced he could never fully close his mouth. His lips hung apart like the hinges of a broken door, and each attempt to eat became a quiet humiliation. The kitchens, once bustling with grand preparations, now toiled in secret, turning every meal into a bland, shapeless paste. Courtiers averted their gaze as servants wiped soup and saliva from the monarch's chin, the once proud ritual of dining reduced to a mournful spectacle. At formal banquets, candlelight danced on tapestries faded by time and sorrow, illuminating the silence that deepened with every clumsy attempt at nourishment. Speech brought no respite. Every royal decree emerged as a muffled struggle, words slipping and tumbling from his misshapen mouth, their meaning lost in the space between intent and sound. Foreign ambassadors expecting commands of imperial strength instead encountered a king whose utterances were almost indecipherable, forcing interpreters to parse not Spanish, but the broken language of a dynasty in decline. Even in moments of hope, Charles felt the sting of isolation, the stifled sighs of his physicians, the averted eyes of courtiers, the closed doors that marked his separation from the world outside. In the flickering shadows of his private chapel, he clung to sacred relics, his frail hands trembling as prayers for deliverance faded into silence. Within these stone walls, every effort to heal or save him teetered between science and superstition. Physicians offered potions and powders, then stepped aside for priests, who whispered exorcisms over his fevered brow, as if by incantation the family curse could be undone. But with each failed remedy, the court grew colder, the corridors longer, the future of Spain more uncertain. The tapestries that lined the halls, once vibrant with the stories of conquest and faith, now seemed to unravel at their edges, a mirror to the fading hopes of a dynasty that had reached its end. Charles II endured, aware of the pity and fear he inspired, yet unable to escape the destiny pressed upon him by the very blood meant to sustain his rule. The crown, grown heavy and ill-fitting, became the last symbol of an empire exhausted in spirit and in flesh, clung to by a king whose body betrayed him at every turn. Behind closed doors, courtiers whispered of omens and portents, their faith in miracles dwindling as the long shadow of extinction crept over Spain. As the line of Habsburgs faltered, the court's desperate rituals, its flickering candles, its whispered prayers, its endless cycles of hope and disappointment, could not stave off the quiet, inexorable decline. When Charles's story ended, it was not in a storm of violence, but in the hush of resignation, his final days, watched over by silent servants and anxious priests. The body that bore so many secrets was committed to the royal tombs, and with it the last withered branch of a once mighty tree. The silence left behind lingered in the palace, heavy and unresolved, as if even the walls mourned the cost of royal blood and the dangers of a crown worn too long by those unable to bear its weight. Palace records linger with the anxious scrawl of Queen Mariana, a mother haunted by the prospect that her only son, the king, might slip away in the night, choked by his own tongue, swallowed by the shadows of his own failing body. In the stifling gloom of the Spanish court, it was whispered with dread that the most powerful ruler in Europe was as fragile as spun glass, a monarch whose existence seemed perpetually at risk from the most mundane threats. The courtiers spoke in low voices, but the real terror was older and deeper. The Habsburgs, fixated on keeping power close, had entangled their lineage so tightly that the cost was now being borne with ruthless clarity by the pale boy on the throne. Power had been valued above flesh, and Charles was the final tragic proof, his body and mind a living testimony to a dynasty's fatal pride. He was from his first breath a figure shaped by forces he could never understand. The famous Habsburg jaw was only the surface of the curse. Beneath the ornate canopies of the palace, Charles moved with the frailty of a wounded sparrow, his form stretched and twisted by nature's indifferent hand. At 35, he resembled a sickly child caught in a man's clothing, barely reaching 5 feet, limbs thin as reeds. A torso hunched and compressed his oversized head, bobbing unsteadily on a neck too feeble to carry its weight. Until the age of 8, he could not walk, his first steps delayed by years spent in frustrated silence, his progress marked not by triumph, but by necessity. When at last he managed to move, it was a lurching, halting shuffle, his hands grasping at the cold stone walls and the stiff edges of Spanish furniture, the courtly silence broken only by the uneven rhythm of his footsteps. He bore a silhouette bent beneath an invisible weight, the outward sign of generations of withered blood and inherited sorrow. The frailty was not only physical. In the stillness of the royal chambers, Charles's mind remained a cloudy mirror, slow to reflect, unable to retain the lessons pressed into him by weary tutors. He could not read until the age of 10, and even then words slipped away from him like water through a cracked vessel. "It is as if one tries to fill a broken jar," sighed one tutor. "What goes in does not remain." His emotions, too, ran wild and unchecked, a king prone to violent outbursts over the smallest slights, followed by hours of silence, lost in a motionless trance, as if time itself had abandoned him. The servants watched in uneasy pity as their sovereign cycled between childish rage and hollow withdrawal, the palace filling with echoes of sorrow and unrest. Even his hair betrayed him, thinning and falling in uneven clumps, the crown upon his head little more than a brittle relic clinging to a scalp, as patchy as the fading fortunes of his house. The painted portraits lining the palace halls became acts of creative mercy court artists, laboring to soften the hard truths of Charles's appearance, but no brush could truly mask the visible unraveling. The most unsettling truth was that the decay did not pause with age, it worsened. While others found a fragile balance in adulthood, Charles only grew weaker, his decline accelerating, his body resisting every attempt at healing. The court's physicians, baffled and fearful, cycled through remedies and rites, sacred relics and whispered exorcisms, as if hoping to banish not illness, but fate itself from the king's fragile frame. Yet the greatest tragedy, more than the daily humiliations, more than the tightening grip of superstition and dread, was the silent understanding that Charles would leave no heir. In him, the Habsburg line, so long guarded and interwoven for the sake of a crown, met its bitter endpoint. Behind closed doors and heavy curtains, the court murmured prayers and desperate charms, each day heavier with the knowledge that the dynasty's strength had collapsed into this single, suffering life. As the flickering candlelight trembled across the faded tapestries and the palace itself seemed to sigh with exhaustion, Charles sat enthroned in solitude, a king beset by shadows, watched over by a court whose hope had turned to fear. Here, in the coldest reaches of royal power, The crown itself became a symbol not of glory, but of the weight of history, an inheritance too heavy for any one life to bear. The mightiest throne in Europe was haunted by a solitary, trembling figure, a king unable to summon an heir from his shadowed lineage. Charles II, frail sovereign of Spain, married twice, clinging to the hope that some twist of fate might spare his dynasty from oblivion. His first bride, Marie-Louise of Orléans, crossed the Pyrenees dreaming of royal promise, only to be greeted by hushed voices and sideways glances in corridors heavy with incense and dread. On their wedding night, the palace itself seemed to recoil. Servants later whispered of the queen's tears and the king's bewildered, distressed silence. The same withered bloodline that had hollowed his body left him too with the innocence of childhood, an adult monarch in form, yet in truth untouched by the years that crowned him. The court could never voice the truth. To confess Charles's frailty was to acknowledge the rot in the roots of empire. Instead, blame was turned upon Marie-Louise. The young queen, bright and lively upon her arrival, found herself transformed into a vessel for courtly suspicion and ritual. She was made to endure humiliating examinations, forced to drink bitter concoctions beneath flickering candlelight, subjected to remedies ancient and unkind. Her private sorrow deepened as the weight of Spain's hopes pressed down upon her days, spent kneeling in prayer nights, haunted by prayers that would never be answered. Some would later whisper that it was not only disappointment, but the accumulated toll of desperate treatments that withered her, leaving her lifeless at just 26. No sooner had the funeral tapers dimmed than Charles was wed again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. The new queen stepped into a world already thick with foreboding. By now, Charles's own decline was impossible to ignore. His body seemed more fragile with each passing day, and the rumors in the palace grew colder and more cruel. Maria Anna, in letters sealed and sent far from prying eyes, described the mounting horror of her predicament, the dawning certainty that the task before her was not simply difficult, but impossible. Still, the court would not yield. Physicians traveled from the far corners of Europe, bearing learned tomes and solemn faces. Sacred relics and magical rites found their way into the royal chambers. Under the dim watch of aging courtiers, Charles suffered indignities in silence, his body prodded and measured as if hope could be conjured by sheer persistence. Yet nothing could mend what centuries of careful breeding had broken. All the while, the great powers of Europe circled like silent carrion outside the palace gates, waiting for the inevitable. Every court, every ambassador watched as Spain's last Habsburg king walked the echoing halls, a living prophecy of extinction, each day bringing the empire one step closer to dissolution. The war for succession was already taking shape in secret chambers and candle-lit councils. The world knew that when Charles fell, the Spanish crown would be cast into the fire of ambition. And so it was that the ancient obsession with bloodlines, which had once made kings and empires, now withered to a single sorrowful life, one that could not deliver the future Spain had been promised. The Habsburgs, architects of their own doom, had pressed the search for purity until the royal blood itself ran dry. In the end, the great crown of Spain gleamed not with promise, but with the cold light of a dying line, its fate sealed in the hushed corridors and desperate prayers of a court grown numb to hope. When medicine failed to provide answers for the waning strength of Charles II, the Spanish court surrendered to shadows, and superstition spread through the corridors like a chill wind. It was not whispers in the dark, but public spectacles that followed as exorcisms unfolded in the gilded halls of the palace. The ancient walls, heavy with the secrets of dynasties past, became the stage for rituals more fitting to nightmare than to reason. The priest declared a single simple verdict for the king's ruined demonic possession. a verdict that echoed the unspoken fears of a lineage decayed by its own blood. Father Froilan Diaz, the king's chief exorcist, stood at the center of these rites, convinced that Charles was inhabited by spirits conjured through malice and witchcraft. There were no veils or secluded chapels. These were ceremonies performed before nobles and foreign envoys, all forced to witness the sovereign's humiliation. Flickering candlelight trembled across the king's frail form as he was made to drink water infused with pulverized relics, each bitter draught provoking convulsions and sickness. Where any other eye might see only suffering, the priests proclaimed triumph the demons were resisting. They said, fleeing before the force of faith. The drama unfolded hour after hour. The king, already frail and confused, was pressed and shaken relics and crucifixes held so hard against his skin that his cries rang out through the stone corridors. Holy water splashed across his brow and onto the ancient tapestries. Prayers in Latin strange and foreign to his ear were forced from trembling lips, each one an incantation against invisible foes. Around him the faces of courtiers were drawn and colorless, caught between disbelief and dread, while foreign dignitaries looked on in haunted silence, bearing witness to a monarchy unraveling before their eyes. But the rituals did not stop with Charles. In the stifling gloom of 1698, Father Diaz decreed that the entire palace was cursed. A frantic cleansing began, servants gathering the relics of the past, the personal effects of dead queens' gifts from distant kingdoms, even the chairs and tables that had borne witness to the decline. These possessions were cast into the courtyard, their destruction marked by bonfires and chanting priests, an echo of old magic cloaked in the authority of the church. Amid the haze of burning memories, the palace seemed to draw inward, suffocated by its own history. Charles, caught in this tide of superstition, clung to every promise of relief. His mind, fragile and trusting, believed the exorcist's assurances that each ceremony weakened the grip of the demons. He begged for more when pain and confusion returned, caught in a cycle of desperation and fleeting hope. The exorcisms reached their fevered climax in 1699, when Father Diaz triumphantly declared that 47 separate spirits had been named and driven out. The king, so battered by these ordeals, collapsed into a silence that lasted for days, his fragile form vanishing even further beneath the weight of unseen adversaries. In truth, while priests struggled with phantoms and burned the remnants of royal memory, Charles was dissolving from within his illness, misunderstood his suffering, exploited the legacy of centuries of inbreeding and ambition. The palace stood darker and more silent, with each passing day, its tapestries fading, its line withering, until when death finally came for the last Habsburg king in 1700, the whole empire shuddered at the quiet, inevitable end of a royal house that had placed its faith in miracles while its hope crumbled to dust. For decades, the courtiers of Spain whispered that their king was marked by something unholy, that Charles II the Bewitched was less a sovereign than a victim of ancestral sin or sorcery. Now, with the dynasty's last hope extinguished, the somber hush of the Escorial was broken only by the anxious murmurs of those gathered to learn the truth of what had dwelled within the frail, enigmatic monarch. Shadows danced across the walls as royal physicians, faces drawn and grave, began their silent examination. What they discovered was so unsettling the official record was hidden away, deemed too dreadful for common ears. Yet, as with all secrets in royal courts, the details seeped through the cracks, and what emerged only deepened the gloom that had long hung over the House of Habsburg. Dr. Geronimo della Fuente Piarola, chief among the king's physicians, recorded a litany of maladies that seemed to echo every rumor of enchantment and doom. He wrote almost in a whisper that the king's body appeared more like that of a monster than a man, containing organs so misshapen and ailing that his very survival defied reason. His heart, so long the focus of hopeful prayers and desperate rituals, was revealed as no larger than a walnut, blackened and shrunken, an emblem of a dynasty's fading pulse. The lungs, corroded and waterlogged, hinted at a life spent struggling for breath, the scent of decay so intense that even seasoned attendants faltered and turned away. Beneath the candlelight, the king's abdomen told its own story, of despair, intestines ruined, and rotting, a body betraying itself from within. Most haunting to those gathered, however, was the discovery that had haunted the court's private anxieties for years: the underdeveloped state of the king's reproductive organs, the physical manifestation of a line cursed never to bear another heir. And when they turned at last to his skull, they found the mind of the king awash in fluid, his brain marked by pallor and damage, a silent explanation for the erratic moods and distant gaze that had become the court's daily torment. Dr. Piarola, in the gloom of the royal chamber, concluded with a phrase that echoed through marble halls and candle-lit chapels. It was a miracle that this body had endured so long, for not one organ remained untouched by ruin. Instead of dispelling the court's superstitions, these findings only hardened them. How else, they wondered, could such a broken vessel linger, except by the hand of unseen powers? Even in death, Charles remained a prisoner of the supernatural, his name spoken with awe and dread, as if the boundaries between curse and nature had vanished. For 38 years, Charles II had inhabited the corridors of power every day, a slow withering every breath, a victory of stubborn will over relentless decline. The hope of empire faded with his last sigh. He left no heir, only the echo of disappointment and the foreboding hush that precedes disaster. As predicted, Europe was plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal reckoning that would stain the continent in blood for years to come. The Habsburgs, obsessed with the purity of their bloodline, had instead orchestrated its extinction, undone by the very isolation they prized. There is a tragic symmetry in his story, a royal line that spent centuries building walls around its power, only to be brought down from within by the frailty of its final heir. Charles II became a living testament to the truth that the gravest threat to absolute rule is not always found in war or rebellion, but in the silent, inexorable workings of fate and flesh. The candles burned low, the tapestries faded, and the palace stood silent, a mausoleum for hope and a warning for all who would believe themselves immune to the quiet, unyielding hand of destiny.